Thank you, Jackie. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'd like to thank the organisers for the invitation to speak at this workshop. I think many people probably won't know me, so I thought I'd just have a slide on who I am and where I come from, really. Can somebody help me out with this screen, please? I'm a bit... Oh, it's okay. It's cleared itself. So, yeah, I'm basically a veterinarian from the 1970s. I did PhD and postdoc work in reproductive endocrinology. I became involved in vaccines in the 1990s through working in industry and also working in regulation and quality assurance. I was then chair of animal health at the RVC for a while. I decided that wasn't for me after a period and went to develop vaccines in what was then Pfizer Animal Health. For the last sort of 13 or so years, I've had my own consultancy company specialising in vaccine development. Through that, I got involved in GalvMed and helping to develop vaccines for developing countries. In 2013, I went to the SRUC as assistant principal in international to help them develop their international business. And then in 2016, I was basically offered a programme by the Gates Foundation called Supporting Evidence-Based Interventions, or SEBI, as it's become known, and that is housed in the vet school here in Edinburgh, across the road, in fact. I've had a lot of experience over the years in regulation of veterinary medicines, particularly as a member when I've been an independent, as an advisor on the UK Veterinary Products Committee. That's the committee that advises the UK Regulatory Authority on veterinary medicine regulation. And I've had a number of years on what's called the Advisory Committee on Releases to the Environment, or ACRE. And ACRE is the committee that advises DEFRA, the relevant ministry, on releases into the environment, as you'll see, but particularly on GMOs. And the work of that particular committee is probably 90% to do with crops. I was the token vet on it, handling the veterinary medicines which contain GMOs, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. So I've been asked to talk about regulation of veterinary vaccines, and I've heard a lot today, very interesting things actually, and I think all of the talks we've had today impinge in some way on what I want to say, and I'll try and pick up some of those things as we move through if I remember. But basically, the data requirements for registration rely on quality, safety and efficacy. We touched on safety and efficacy in the previous talk actually, but we didn't talk much about quality. And for me, quality is really the key to the whole thing. If you get the quality right, the other things can take care of themselves to some extent, and I'll say more about that as we go through. Regulation is not everybody's cup of tea. Most people here probably are more interested in talking about immunology, interleukins, cytokines, T cells, whatever. And so there's a lot of fairly detailed information here, which I'm not necessarily going to cover, but it is covered to an extent in the slides, and I'll circulate the slides afterwards for reference for anybody who wants to follow up on it. So I want to talk about, first of all, about the product development process. And sorry, I'm struggling with this screen. It's not working quite as it should. So I'm going to move to this one. Now, this is a simplistic representation of the new product development process. So research, discovery, product development, registration and marketing. And the first, probably the gateway, is what I would call proof of concept. And it's that research phase which is actually pre-proof of concept. And we've heard quite a bit earlier about what that proof of concept entails. Is that vaccine candidate, is that new antigen, is it efficacious? But there's another component to that as well. that the industry is interested in. Can we actually manufacture it? Can we actually manufacture it, potentially, and sell it at a profit? Because ultimately, for most vaccines, it's economics which is going to drive this, and return on investment for that company. There are exceptions if it's a public good, obviously, but by and large, this is an important component. Also at that point, we often see transfer from academia to industry. Not always. Some companies have their own discovery department, obviously, but very often that transfer can occur at that stage. Registration comprises dossier preparation and then submission to the authorities and then negotiation with the authorities to get that approval. And after that approval is obtained, then the product would be launched and it would be marketed. Now, what I've done in this next slide is to separate out two components of development. One I've called exploratory and one I've called full development. And different terminologies and slightly different processes are used in different companies. But broadly what the difference is that in exploratory, you've got some idea of proof of concept. Yes, we think we can develop this into a product that is effective and we can manufacture it and it is high quality and safe and all those things as well. But we need to do some tweaking. We need to play around with some formulations to get it right, to optimize it. And that's what that means. And from here on, full development actually means we've now decided what our final formulation is going to be, what our final product is going to be. And that is absolutely critical because for the key registration studies, those studies have to be done with the final product. Otherwise, they're potentially invalid. I should say as well at the beginning that research and development, I was trying to think about how you differentiate these. And it's probably, again, simplistic, but research, you know what research is about. It's about asking questions, it's about forming hypotheses and testing them, thinking what will happen if I do this. Whereas development is actually the process you go through once you have decided what the product is going to be. So at a certain stage in this, a company would say, right, this is the product we want to develop, and we will write a profile for it. What are the characteristics of that product going to be? And then that is what we're aiming for. So it's a very different perspective on doing things. So, sorry, I mentioned the decision on final formulation at that point. Now, after registration, that is not the end of regulation. There's a thing called post-marketing pharmacovigilance, which basically is a process by which issues of safety or efficacy can be identified in the field. If there are problems, if there are complaints, etc. Also, in the case of vaccines, certainly in Europe and many other countries, there is some kind of process of control of each batch before it's released. It may be administrative, that the company has to do certain tests and submit those documents to the regulatory authority. In some instances, it can be the regulatory authority carrying out independent tests themselves. And then also in some parts of the world, there are periodic reviews of marketing authorizations. This has been the case in Europe, but it's going to disappear in the future. The other thing is that in European countries also, we have a thing called the legal category. What is the way that this product is actually distributed? How is it moved, or then from the distributor to the end user? We're talking about livestock, it's to the farmer. And in this country, for example, we have what's called POMV, prescription-only medicine, veterinary, or prescription-only medicine VPS, which is veterinary pharmacist or so-called SQP, a specially qualified, suitably qualified person. And those two categories mean that certain advice is required to the owner before that product can be sold to them. So a bit more about quality, safety and efficacy. Quality, in the case of a pharmaceutical, it probably just helps to explain this first. It's about the chemistry and the pharmaceutical aspects of the active ingredient and the final product. In the case of a vaccine, which is usually a biological molecule, this is about identity and characterization of the antigen. But in both cases, the other quality aspects concern the manufacture, purity, stability, etc., with the emphasis on quality assurance, quality control, and indeed validation of all the tests that are used. Thinking about livestock or food animals, safety is by and large 4 components. Safety to the target animal, that the vaccine is not going to kill the animal or make it sick. And this relates a little bit to Jonathan's question, actually. It's not probably quite the same thing as welfare, but effectively, if there is a significant impact on the health or well-being of that animal, that would be shown up, or at least that's where you would test that in the case of safety to the target animal. Secondly, safety to the human consumer of animal products. Thirdly, any operator handling or administering the product, or indeed manufacturing it. And fourthly, to the environment. And I'm going to say a bit more about some of these later. What is efficacy? It's the ability to produce the desired result. And I've actually deliberately avoided using the word effective here, because effectiveness in epidemiological terms has a specific meaning, and efficacy has a specific meaning. So I've tried to avoid that. So does it do what it is claimed? Does it actually work? And we would say here, does it do what it says on the tin? So I don't know whether any of you know this person. Friend and colleague of mine who actually works now for the EMA, European Medicines Agency. And he's demonstrating here the size of a vaccine dossier, a veterinary vaccine dossier in 1994. Then he did it again in 2004. And the obvious thing to say is that he's grown older, but you can see also that the data requirements or over that period certainly grew. Actually, he sent me a photograph at the weekend. He's just run a 180-kilometre marathon in Greece last weekend, and he looks considerably older than this now, I can tell you. But anyway, so since 2004, data requirements have, of course, increased even more, but now it can be just about contained on a large USB stick. I'm going to talk mostly about the EU, actually, even though the UK is likely not to be in it in the future, but nevertheless I think it will continue to have a significant impact on our lives. So again, I'm not going to go too much into detail, but I just wanted to list these things for completeness. Really, the European legislation in relation to veterinary medicines dates back to 1981. These two directives, 81, 851 and 852. But for current regulations, it's really about this one, Directive 2001-82, and the subsequent amendments and regulations associated with it. So all these things are enshrined very, very clearly in legislation. Now, a little bit of history here, because maybe some of you think that we in the UK are not very good Europeans, but we... Or at least not very, well, we're rather reluctant Europeans, let's say. But in fact, we were very, very actively involved in the development of the legislation in Europe relating to veterinary medicines. And this relates back really to this document, which is the Medicines Act of 1968. The Medicines Act of 1968 was actually introduced in the wake of the thalidomide tragedy, and most of you will know what that related to, and it was related to an unsafe medicinal product that was used in pregnant women. And really there was very little legislation before that time. At least it was to some extent voluntary, and so the Medicines Act came about, and that included both human medicines and veterinary medicines. Now then, The veterinary medicines became enshrined in EU legislation later on, as I've just shown you. But then, and that was then introduced into British legislation through this regulation document in 2013, and basically veterinary medicines were taken out of the overall medical context. In other words, they were separated from human medicine. There's a lot of detail available to companies, organisations who wish to apply for marketing authorisations for veterinary products, and this tells you how to do it. It's called Volume 6B, Notice to Applicants, Veterinary Medicinal Products, Presentation and Content of the Dossier. So that spells out in great detail about how to write a dossier. In terms of then what you do when you've got your dossier, there are basically three routes in Europe by which you can apply. And the first the first is the Centralized Procedure, which allows marketing authorization to be obtained and made available in all the member states simultaneously. And when this was introduced, it particularly applied to so-called high-tech products. And these were defined in the annex to the regulation on the previous slide. Secondly, it is possible to obtain marketing authorizations to be obtained in a single country of the EU. And thirdly, there's a process called the decentralized procedure, where applications for authorization of a product are obtained in a single member state initially, the so-called reference member state, and that basically is the lead assessor of that dossier. And then if it is approved by that member state, then the other member states, the so-called concerned member states, where the product's going to be marketed, get a kind of shortened version of the submission with recommendations accordingly. So a little bit more about the centralized procedure for Europe. It's one application, one scientific evaluation by the Committee for Veterinary Medicinal Products. And the CVMP, the Committee for Veterinary Medicinal Products, comprises members and usually officials from each of the member states. And as I mentioned, there would be authorization in all the EU member states, plus the European Economic Area, of which I see there are three. I'm sorry, I couldn't tell you who they all are, but actually Norway is one, I can't think. One so-called invented name or trade name for the product, and then product information, summary of product characteristics, the SPC, used to be known as the data sheet. So it gives you all the characteristics of the product, and similar documents, which are the labelling and also the package leaflet. All these are quite carefully controlled. And then those are actually translated into all the respective EU languages. So I'm going to just talk very briefly through the dossier contents, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. And it's normally divided into 6 parts. The first part is just a summary. It's the administrative information like name and address of the company, the site of manufacture, etc. The SPC, the so-called data sheet, and labelling and all of that stuff. And then also there is for each of the parts, quality, safety and efficacy, there used to be a thing called the expert reports. And these were normally independently written. They don't have to be, but normally independent. But they are supposed to be a critical review of the contents of the dossier. And there are 3, one each for quality, safety and efficacy. Then parts 2, 3 and 4 are quality, safety and efficacy. And I've talked already about what those comprise. Part 5 is so-called particulars and summaries, and then references at the end. Just to dig into quality a little bit more, part 2, chemical, pharmaceutical and biological, microbiological information. And it's about qualitative and quantitative particulars of the constituents. What's in it? How do you make it? description of the manufacturing method. Control of starting materials. Where do you buy your reagents from? Where does it all come from? What kind of quality are they? Control tests at intermediate stages. You think you're processing it in a certain way to produce an intermediate product. How do you know? What are the tests you do on that? How do you evaluate your quality at the end of the process? Control tests on finished product. Stability. How long is it stable for? What are the storage conditions? And any further relevant information. So there's a lot more in there, but I'm not going to go into that for the purposes of this afternoon. The other thing I should mention, actually, which is it's crucial, but we tend not to think about too much when we're talking research, and that's GMP, good manufacturing practice. And it has to be remembered that in the EU, veterinary vaccines and indeed all veterinary products have to be produced to good manufacturing practice. There is a thing here called the Orange Guide, which is this particular version is published by the MHRA, which is the UK Human Medicine Regulatory Agency, but it's essentially taking European regulations, translating them into the UK situation, and this applies equally to veterinary products as it does to human products. I want to say a bit more about safety, part 3, mainly focusing on what I've called B there, laboratory tests. So you have to do certain prescribed tests under certain conditions, and safety tests are all done to GLP standard. It's required to do them to GLP standard. Safety of administration of one dose, and there's a prescribed way of monitoring the safety, usually over a 14-day period. Safety of an administration of an overdose, and also a repeated administration of one dose. Examination of reproductive functions and immunological performance. Those are actually only necessary where there is a suggestion that any of the starting materials could actually be a risk factor. We've touched on this as well a bit today, special requirements for live vaccines, and things like looking at the spread of the vaccine strain, dissemination in the vaccinated animal, reversion to virulence, particularly important of attenuated vaccines. And as we know, there are cited instances where this has happened in the field. And biological properties of the vaccine strain, recombination or genomic reassortment of the vaccine strain. So these things, in the case of a live attenuated vaccine, are looked at very, very closely indeed. Also under safety, I mentioned user safety, study of residues. Residues usually not much of an issue with vaccines because they're usually protein in nature and not normally relevant to that particular aspect, except where there are certain excipients like adjuvants which maybe do have the possibility of residues in food and maybe have some kind of toxicological profile. And then also interactions with other veterinary products shall be described. And this is an interesting one because it's very difficult to do actually, because you think, well, how can we cater for any other product being administered at the same time? And companies usually get round this by saying this vaccine should not be administered with any other veterinary product. Field studies are also required to confirm the results from the lab, and those are normally required to be done to good clinical practice standard, and they're often these days done in combination with a field efficacy study too. D, particularly important, getting more and more important, environmental risk assessment. What are the risks to the environment, and to identify any precautionary measures needed. And under EU law, there is a separate requirement for looking at the environmental risks of GMOs. And in the case of veterinary medicinal products containing GMOs, the application has to be accompanied by another document which is a specific environmental risk assessment for that GMO. And that in UK is actually dealt with by a different agency from the normal veterinary medicines agency. In terms of efficacy, I'm just going to move down to chapter 2, general requirements, something about the justification really. Why have you chosen that antigen? To talk about the need for control trials, what influenced the design of those studies, and is there a need, for example, for a companion diagnostic test? For example, if a DIVA claim is made. And that happens in quite a few instances these days. Laboratory studies, need for well-controlled laboratory challenge trials, usually done at minimum titer or minimum potency, and if possible the immune mechanism should be demonstrated or at least explained, and that often is with vaccines to date is not known. Test for onset of immunity, and in particular duration of immunity. How long does that immunity last? And some of these studies, as you'll know very well, are quite difficult to design and execute. And then field studies. Field studies are required, and as I mentioned, they're normally done in combination with field safety study to GCP. In fact, with many vaccines, particularly with some of the endemic diseases, it's well recognised that one might not get a challenge in a field study, and the regulatory agencies do take a fairly sympathetic approach to this, provided there's good data from the laboratory studies. So just to say a bit more about GMOs. In the EU there are 2 directives which are relevant to the use of GMOs in veterinary medicinal products, which are separate from the rest of the veterinary medicines legislation. So the Directive 92/19, which is on the contained use, and then Directive 2001/18, which is on the deliberate release into the environment. And 2001/18 requires the submission of a dossier, as I mentioned before, specifically on the environmental risk, known as the ERA. That's known as Part B when applying for permission to release for the purposes of a field trial, and Part C when applying for the full manufacturing authorization. Now, that's straightforward enough, but it comes a bit messier when we start to talk about the letter of the law. So you'll note that this directive was at least released in 2001. It was written in the late 90s. And a GMO is defined as an organism, with the exception of human beings, in which genetic material has been altered in a way that doesn't occur naturally by mating and or natural recombination. Now, these are some of the techniques of genetic modification which are described in the specific article in that directive. Not going to read them out to you, but I'll read out a bit. Recombinant nucleic acid techniques involving formation of new combinations of genetic material by the insertion of nucleic acid molecules. Secondly, techniques involving the direct introduction into an organism of heritable material prepared outside the organism, blah, blah, blah. Thirdly, cell fusion, including protoplast fusion or hybridization techniques where live cells with new combinations of heritable genetic material are formed. So you might look at those and think, well, things have moved on a little bit since then. And that is quite true. So that, as I mentioned, those definitions were drawn up in the 1990s, and the science has moved on. And these definitions have now become quite contentious. The problem is that they currently remain as the basis of the legal framework. And some have argued that the definition should be based not on the method of preparation, the genetic manipulation, but on the phenotype of the product. And this is pretty much the case in the way it's handled in the US. And going back to the UK, we're, as I mentioned earlier, we are rather difficult Europeans. And the ACRE committee in the UK has argued through this publication, Pollock and Hales, that basically the GMO legislation is outmoded here, and we should be assessing it on the basis of the phenotype, not the method of production. As I say, it's contentious, not everybody agrees. these are some of the things one has to do in that environmental risk assessment for GMO release. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but it's all about the, first of all, characterization of the GMO, understanding what the construct is, etc., its stability, what happens when it actually gets into the environment. In the terms on the human side, because also human vaccines have to go through this same kind of approach and other GMO techniques. And if I can give you the human analogy, that probably helps a little bit. And what this means is what the risk is to any other human being, but non-target human being. So what's the potential risk to a non-target human being who happens to come into contact with this GMO? So if somebody's being vaccinated with a GMO and there are the person doing it or other people around, what impact can it have on them? Or indeed what impact it can have on other species? And I just list on this slide some of the other headings that one has to address in order to perform this environmental risk assessment. When you've actually done all that, they actually use a matrix to assess that risk. So along the horizontal axis, you have likelihood. This is usually actually in risk assessment. The likelihood of the hazard. What is the likelihood of the hazard against the consequence of that hazard? So you have severe, moderate, low, negligible, or high, moderate, low, negligible, and then the various permutations of that here. And how that's dealt with basically is that if it's negligible or low, then you would normally say that's fine, we don't need to worry too much about that. If it's moderate, it may be allowable, but we need to take some kind of mitigation actions to control how that behaves in the environment. And then obviously it's high, that probably would not be allowable. But that's just a hypothetical kind of view about how these things are assessed in practice. The European Medicines Agency, EMA, is the regulatory agency for both human medicines and veterinary medicine regulation. It's based in Canary Wharf in London, and in addition to being a regulatory body, it can also offer both informal and formal scientific advice. For example, on the appropriate tests and studies in the development of a veterinary medicine, designed to facilitate the development and availability of high quality, effective and acceptably safe medicines. So, we come to the vexed question of Brexit. How will this work when we are outside the EU? And by we, I mean the UK, obviously. Many people will know that the EMA is moving to Amsterdam at huge cost. It's likely, I think, that we would be a member of the European Economic Area, or EFTA, for example, Norway, although none of that really is clear at this point in time. But if we do, assuming we do that, then we would continue to comply with EU requirements for veterinary medicine regulation and adopt the same regulations. So in other words, nothing would tangibly change. And there's a huge sensitivity in government really to not allowing this change, major change, to damage industry in any way. And a lot of concern about what actually happens on day one when we are outside the EU. It's suggested that we would actually probably need an EU base from which to apply, but all of this is still very much work in progress, and the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, the UK agency, are actually not saying very much. They are working on it, but there's not much. If you go on the website, it's not. I don't think it's even mentioned. I wanted to talk a little bit about the US. All pharmaceuticals and human vaccines are regulated by the FDA in the US, but it's different for veterinary vaccines or biologics, which are regulated by USDA under the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service the Centre for Veterinary Biologics in Ames, Iowa. The requirements are laid out in the Veterinary Services Memorandum, and there are some other differences in that new applicants are encouraged to contact informally first. That's just the heading of the relevant memorandum. In relation to GMOs, there are quite a few differences because there is no federal US legislation, at least that's my understanding, specific to GMOs per se. There is regulation through health, safety and environmental aspects governing conventional products, but it's focused on the nature of the product rather than the process in which they were produced, the phenotype, if you like, rather than the method. So compared to other countries, regulation of GMOs in the US is relatively favourable to their development. And they're clearly an economically important component of the biotech industry in the US and play a significant role in the US economy. And for example, the US, as you're probably aware, is the world's leading producer of GM crops. So I just wanted to do a compare and contrast between the EU and US systems. In the EU, GMP production is required for veterinary vaccines. For the US, it's not actually required, but the quality is ensured through a document that's called the Outline of Production. So the company concerned has to produce a document that describes in a lot of detail the manufacturing premises and processes. In EU, the dossier is divided into several distinct parts, including particular safety, quality and efficacy. Those sections are not used in the US. Separate legislation for GMOs, but not in Europe, but not in the US. In the EU, the dossier is normally submitted as a completed document, the whole thing together, whereas it can be submitted in phases in the US. There are fixed times in the EU by which the agency has to respond to an application, but there are no such fixed times between submission and response in the US. And there are some other things here which I won't go into. Again, has been mentioned earlier this afternoon, there are a number of GMO vaccine platforms registered in at least one region of the world, and particularly in the poultry section, and a few are mentioned here, produced by SIVA, Boehringer Ingelheim, Merial and Merck. I should touch on so-called mutual recognition between regions. In other words, is it necessary to actually register a product directly in your target country? And there are arrangements, for example, in the US called free sale certificates and certificates of licensing and inspection, where the USDA might have approved it and that would be valid in certain Latin American countries, for example. And one of the things is people are looking at this as a possibility for some sub-Saharan African countries. There is also a thing called the VICH, the Veterinary International Cooperation on Harmonisation, which was an arrangement between the US, EU and Japan with some other observers to try to develop harmonised tests, particularly for quality and safety. There's also a new EU regulation in draft form. It's been doing the rounds for some years already, but it's going to tighten up some loopholes actually. And one of the things it contains is an Article 138, which says that scientific opinion for international organisations for animal health, which would allow in effect assessment of products on behalf of third countries. And again, this is something that is potentially for consideration for certain countries in Africa. How am I doing for time, Jackie? 4? Okay. I just want to say a word or two about Africa, actually, because it's an area that I've been involved in the last 10 years in vaccine development and regulation. And there are individual national regulatory agencies which are mostly linked to human regulatory agencies, but standards vary considerably, and it's actually very difficult to find out exactly what the standards are in some circumstances. So it's quite a challenging environment to work in. In terms of sub-Saharan Africa, it's probably fair to say that South Africa is the most advanced. There is a mutual recognition process in West Africa, and there has been a recent development of a kind of mutual recognition process in a number of countries in East Africa, which GalvMed have pioneered. The other organisation I should mention for Africa is an organisation called AU PANVAC, that's African Union PANVAC, and they exist to be responsible for quality control of veterinary vaccines, reagent production and training in Africa. It's probably fair to say that they tend to be quite short of resources, although they have had a lot of investment in recent years and their capacity has improved considerably. This is just to give you an example of the availability of veterinary medicines in sub-Saharan Africa, and it happens to be somewhere I was in Uganda. And there's clearly significant availability of lots of veterinary products, and vaccines are available as well, as you can see there. The problem is that some of these are kind of recognisable, some are not, and there is a huge problem of counterfeit products and otherwise illegal products, and it's very difficult to sort one from the other in a way. I just wanted to mention this in passing. There's some direct experience I had of registering a product in Africa, and the previous speaker mentioned the East Coast fever vaccine, Maguga cocktail, and this is a preparation not of an attenuated parasite but a live parasite, a live virulent parasite in the sporozoites. And we, against all the odds actually, we managed, this was a very useful product for control of ECF in East Africa, and I was actually given the job some years ago of writing the dossier for this and getting it registered in Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, and even sort of 8 or 9 years on, we're still trying for Uganda. We haven't quite made that due to some largely GMP issues. I was going to talk about DNA vaccines, but I'm not, as I'm running out of time. I just wanted to say this. We talked about decisions for product development earlier. You need to think about which product you're aiming at, which antigen, but which market is that antigen suitable for? Is this a public or a private good? In other words, if it's a private good, it needs to be done at a profit. Somebody needs to make money out of it. So there has to be return on investment. Return on investment probably for the pharmaceutical, obviously for the pharmaceutical company, but also for the farmer who's using it. What's the route to market? Who are the commercial partners? What exploratory studies do we need to optimize the formulation? What is the cost of goods? How much does it cost to make? And then we need that decision on the final formulation and focus on development. Define that product profile. What is it we're actually aiming to produce at the end of all this work? And draw up the necessary product development plan. I'm just going to finish with this actually. Some of you may have seen this before, but it's an area that I've been very interested in the last 10 or 15 years. The interaction between academia and industry in development of veterinary products. And if you can just imagine that first meeting between a company R&D director and an academic researcher. I've developed a new vaccine for lumpy cow disease. So the company man says, how big is the market? And the researcher says, well, quite a few farms around here are affected. How effective is it? Have you patented it? And how much does it cost to make? Well, when I say a vaccine, I mean I think we might have identified some candidate protective antigens. You mean they protect cattle against challenge? No, but they seem quite effective in mice. We did an experiment in 2 calves, but the results were a bit equivocal, although one did seroconvert. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy, for the nice stereotypes at the end of the end of that talk. I just like to throw it out to the floor. I'm literally throw it out to the floor.
Oh,
Yeah,
right.
and I'm going to give it to Andy because he looks more of a rugby player than me.
No forward passing.
So we get oh, there's Jonathan. I don't know if we're
We're
going
going to have to go halfway.
Yeah, he looks like a rugby player. We're going to pull it out at these things. Turn it on.
Oh,
Right, use the English team then.
touche.
If not, we can give you the real microphone. We just thought we'd make it a bit more fun because it's like...
Is that on? Yeah.
Yeah.
Just you jokingly put up that dossier thing. So how much has the cost to actually register a vaccine or a product gone up in that time period? And you kind of touched on international standardization, but you didn't talk about probably two of the biggest markets in terms of livestock, which would be India and China. So could you just sort of give a few comments around those two areas?
What was the first one again? I've got a short attention span.
I'm kind of interested. So you're going from a dossier about that thick to like 25 dossiers, which must be a huge increase in cost. Are we actually increasing the safety or the quality in that process? Are we just generating more bureaucracy and more?
There was a huge focus around that time on quality, and I showed that orange guide thing, which is the GMP guide. And it was kind of interesting. I worked for a pharmaceutical company in vaccine production at that time. And one day the inspector turned up and said, "I'm inspecting you for GMP." And he went all over the place, and he came out and virtually threatened to close us down. And he said, "You're not complying with this and you're not complying with that. It's all in the orange guide." And we said, "Yeah, but we worked to the orange guide. Here it is. I've got it in my cupboard. I've got it on my bookshelf, you know. Yeah, but we're interpreting it differently now." And so there was a huge change at that time in the 90s to increase the strictness with which they interpreted that guide. And there was a change from a quality control philosophy, if you like, to a quality assurance. And I'll explain a bit what I mean by that. So in the olden days, you just made the product, did some tests on it, and if they passed the test, that was okay. But the quality, and that was a quality control approach. What changed was they say, no, what we want is a quality assurance approach where you design a high quality process and you monitor that at every stage and you validate everything. So that's where all the costs came in. And then clearly the human, not just the human, but the safety aspects were ramped up as well. You asked me what the cost is of developing a vaccine, and it's a question of how long is a piece of string in a way, because it depends where you start. I mean, if you start from scratch saying, well, we want a vaccine against, ASF and African swine fever, and we haven't got anything to start with. If you've got to start doing all that work from scratch, it's going to take many millions. On average, they say maybe $10 to $12 million. India and China, yeah, clearly very important. I showed you my sort of brief CV, and I was going to say at the end of that, one day I'll decide what I want to be when I grow up. But I think I'm an old man now, and India and China have kind of moved on. I don't know too much about them, I suppose, is the honest answer, really. But yes, obviously they have come on in leaps and bounds. In China, huge pig and poultry industries, probably science to match that in terms of infection and immunity. The huge growth of that related science there, and vaccine production as well. Where's Brian? We were just talking to Tim Dole a few weeks ago, who'd returned from China, a huge FMD plant going up there. So there's huge investment in China in India, I mean, in particular, has been known for years now as a very significant generic pharmaceutical producer, and there's a lot going on there in terms of biotech as well, producing potential new approaches to immunology. So yeah, clearly they're going. And India is the biggest dairy industry has the biggest dairy industry in the world now. So clearly those countries are going to be hugely important and potentially dominate in future.
Got it back for the English team here.
First of all, thanks very much for a really good talk. It was really good to hear a regulatory talk with only 2 slides listing directives. Question I had was about DIVA vaccines. You mentioned it in one slide, and something just occurred to me. There's a lot of regulation about the vaccine side, but obviously with diagnostics, there's no regulation. How does that interact when you come to a DIVA vaccine?
Yeah. First of all, on the congratulations about the slide. I actually produced the slides, and I've got a researcher who works for me who's quite creative, and I took the slides to him and said, "Look, I'm doing this slide on regulation. Slides are really boring. Can you make them a bit more interesting for me?" So I shouldn't take the credit for that. But on the DIVA thing, it's a question of what's claimed for the vaccine. So if the claims are such that can be used, the vaccine can be used, but that there is a diagnostic test which will differentiate use of the vaccine from natural infection, then you have to produce the data to demonstrate that. But you're not actually regulating the diagnostic per se, except almost by the back door, I guess. But it's if you're making claims for the vaccine as being a potential DIVA, then you have to show the respective data for the diagnostic. Sorry. Oh, there's a rugby game going on behind you.
We need some people, French people, can we get a Five Nations thing going? We get any Italians?
I mean, time for breath.
It's your turn, isn't it? Now you get your own back, Brian.
No, not at all. I've forgotten I was going to ask now. Blimey. So you had to skip a few slides at the end, Andy, and one of the reasons that I particularly like to hear you give this talk, and it was great, was that people, when they have this germ of an idea of a vaccine, or maybe even have identified an antigen, so who would you go to sanity check that? You could go to somebody in industry, or you're discussing the EMEA. Who would you think are the best people to approach to see whether it's really worth pursuing as a vaccine candidate?
Well, if it was in the UK, probably VMD, because VMD tend to be very informal. This is the Veterinary Medicines Directorate for non-UK people. They're very informal. They're very helpful. It's a little bit more difficult, I think, with the EMA because they are a bit more formal. So you have to go through certain process to get through the door. But it's feasible. But I mean, there's an organisation called the Association of Veterinary Consultants, which I happen to be a member of. A large number of veterinarians, ex-industry, who know how to do these things. And find one of them. There's a website, avc.org. So that would probably be a good way of doing it. But that slide, my jokey slide at the end, obviously was a bit one-sided, but it's to make a point. And the point is that there is this thing called a translation gap, and it comes between research discovery and development, because, as I mentioned, that's often where the transfer might take place, where an academic researcher gets to a point, look, I've really got something here, I want somebody to develop it. And I think things have got a lot better, because it was called a gap, and everybody was going around saying, mind the gap. Or at least they were 10 or 12 years ago. But it has got better because these things were recognised. I think academia recognised that it had to work more effectively with industry and vice versa. And then governments and other funding bodies realised there was a gap probably in funding, because academic scientists think, yeah, I've got this great new antigen or great new vaccine, as I said, and then the company guy comes along and says, well, actually, you haven't got very much at all. And there's a lot of work to do to get it to a point where we would even make a decision on it. And that was recognised as a funding gap. And we've had quite a lot of funding, maybe not enough in terms of translational type funding to try to plug that, I would say. But go to talk to somebody like the VMD, go to talk to a consultant, go to talk to the companies. If you know, I mean, most people will know somebody in a company, and just have an informal chat. I should jump in quick, actually.
Thank you. So my question, there's another question here too, I think, is as far as vaccine efficacy for the experimental, and you said there's some field data required, is that all generated only by the vaccine company, or is there any request for input from an independent evaluator?
I don't think, well, certainly in EU, there's no requirement on the company to do anything other than do it themselves, if that's what they want to do. Most these days would probably operate through some kind of contract research organisation, which would probably be a commercial one. But otherwise, they may well work with an academic collaborator. I mean, that happens a lot too. Probably just depends on the circumstances, the merits of the particular case. And there may be some other, let's say, more scientific questions that they want to ask as part of those studies so they would want to involve a collaborator. I was involved in developing vaccines in the US, but it's a while ago, and I've forgotten quite exactly how we did the field studies, to be frank, so I can't really speak for that. But I don't think anything's really so prescribed that there's not that degree of flexibility about it.
So I'm asking that question because my question really is there any concern about the independence of the data generated within a company versus having it externally evaluated?
It's probably the elephant in the room sometimes, but I think most companies who are still in business are trusted, but there are occasional ones who cross a line and get in trouble for it. But by and large, those, well, you can take my word for this or not. I mean, I worked in industry half my career. I consider myself a fairly honest individual. I don't think I'm that much different from anybody else in the room. So, and that's what companies are made up of. So I think everybody's, well, charitable view is everybody's there trying to do an honest job, trying to do the best they can. I don't think they're necessarily trying to pull the wool over anyone's regulator's eyes, actually. And actually, I think it would be, I don't know, Jackie, you may disagree, but I think it will be extremely difficult to get away with that for under the conditions we operate in for very long at all, actually.
Yeah, I think there's a very high level of scrutiny. And I think it would be really hard to do that. And often, as Andy says, certainly a lot of the dossiers we would be exposed to are often done by contract, the companies themselves. And more I see this with the big pharmas, they're branching out into subcontract to research contract organisations, and it might not all be one supplier that supplies the different bits of the dossier, because different parts would do quality, and they might do safety and efficacy together. And I think as well, the other thing to say is to speak to your academic partner as early as possible. Not just I've got an antigen, but certainly our experience is if you start to talk about an industry partner and their regulatory people, they start to go, have you thought about your seed stocks, for example? Oh, okay, because any trials that you can do within the academic organisations, if we decide on the formulation and the seed stocks are the same, going to go into your dossier, then we can include that data. So I would say for people, if you do have a great finding, reach out to academic industry partners. There's different routes to do it. You can do a web search and find there's companies that actually try to team you up. Innovate UK in the UK is really good for that. And speak to them early in your process, because actually the earlier you speak, the less you have to repeat later on. And we actually went to the BMD together, our commercial partners, and spoke to them as well. So you're taking all that information as an academic and say, well, let's do this now, so that the company itself doesn't have to repeat it at some stage. But I think it would be really hard to, I mean, maybe that's just an eternal optimist that we are, to get in rogue data, I think, into a dossier that's so extensive.
One way we tried to get around this in Europe was to have these detailed and critical summaries, these so-called expert reports, for each of the 3 sections. Now, the safety and efficacy ones are usually done by an independent person, but at the end of the day, they're still paid for by the company will hire them to do that. They'll pay them, I don't know how many €1,000 or whatever it is to write that report, and they are supposed to be, what they say, detailed and critical. However, if the company's paying the consultant to write the report or the professors to write the report, then, you know, obviously there's going to be a kind of a certain direction of it. In relation to quality, it's very often difficult to find anyone outside of the company who knows enough about the actual specific production process to do that. So it's usually a company employee who does that. So that whole system is not really fit for purpose. And I mentioned a new regulation coming out in the EU, and I think they're being dropped altogether, actually, because they realise that they're kind of ticking a box, but other than that, they probably don't get read all that carefully, actually, because they are not that robust in terms of their independence, possibly.
And just a quick question, is there any fast track for a vaccine, animal vaccine, if there's a new emerging highly pathogenic organism?
Yes, there are. There are specific fast tracks for things like changes with influenza, with blue tongue, I believe, actually. And those are probably the most, the ones I can most readily pull to mind. Yeah.
I think Gary, and then over there. And you go first.
Actually, my question is following a bit the previous one. Well, the first of the previous one, and is related to fundings. And you were talking about the ownership and the value of the good, and actually you were talking about the need for the product to be to reach some productivity gain for farmers, industries, and I just wanted to gather your opinion on products that not only are financed by the private sector, but obviously by the public sector, and so by taxpayers, and to ensure that actually the vaccine we are developing are also reflecting, public values and benefits for society.
Yeah, there are those cases where, as I said, a public good as opposed to a private good, and in that case, if society or the government or some other agency wants to encourage the use of that vaccine, or indeed make it compulsory, there would normally be some financial mechanism to do that, whether it be completely free of charge to the farmer or subsidy of some kind. So yes, there is provision to do that. And there are a number of instances, actually, particularly with food safety, because there are a number of instances where there are important pathogens from the point of view of consumers that come from farm livestock, but don't cause clinical impact in the livestock, at least not significant impact. And the E. coli 0157 was a case in point, actually, and the Canadians produced a vaccine for that for cattle. But I don't even know whether it's still available, but they struggled to actually market that because they were trying to sell it on the basis of the importance for consumer safety, but yet it doesn't have any productive impact on the cattle. And so there is no real incentive for a farmer to buy that vaccine and vaccinate his cattle. And there are others. The salmonella in pigs in Europe was another case in point where there was a good need for a vaccine for salmonella in swine from the point of view of food safety. But no company has actually taken that on because they couldn't see how to make any money out of it. Actually, I'd like to have a further discussion about some of these things because one of the things you were talking about was economics. And okay, it's very company biased, but a company would normally do studies of a livestock vaccine, what are normally called phase 4 studies, post-marketing studies, to evaluate the economic impact. So is the farmer actually getting any benefit from this vaccine? They're not required to do that for registration purposes, and some of those studies might be quite complex and they might be bigger than they want to invest in for registration purposes, but afterwards they will often do those kinds of studies, and that may be somewhere, if you were interested, where you could actually participate from the point of view of socioeconomics.
So my question was about your point about measuring the onset and duration of immunity. In terms of existing vaccines, I've had trouble when I've tried to find that information in terms of either getting detail that makes me convinced that that information is actually based on observations of measuring a positive immune correlate or on challenge studies. So my question is really about how well do you think that is currently done, because it does relate to the discussion we had this morning about confidence in vaccines.
Onset very poorly, and you might get away, if you were a company, you would say, well, if we can show seroconversion, that shows we're getting some response to the vaccine, whether it's protective or not, it means it's seen the vaccine. So we'll call that onset of immunity. On a good day, the regulator might say, okay, I'll let that go. For duration, it's a significant technical challenge, because if you want to show 2 or 3 years duration of immunity, you've got to keep animals clean for that period of time before you challenge them. And that can be quite difficult, and it's certainly very expensive. So I can't remember exactly what the word, if a company can register a vaccine and choose not to do that, and I think they would not be given a nominal DOI, or it's said that the duration of immunity has not been evaluated. So they're supposed to tick the box, but the hurdle to get over to actually demonstrate it in terms of challenge is quite a big one, actually. Mm-hmm. And another case in point, this was one of the reasons, a big reason in my opinion, why we had all the trouble a few years ago over the dog and cat vaccines. You know, what is the appropriate revaccination interval? Because it was all based on anecdote and experience, really, and nobody had any DOI data. Yeah. And nobody had any DOI data because the experiments are too expensive, but also you've got to keep all those animals under confinement for all that time before, and then challenge them with some pretty nasty pathogens. So nobody really ever wanted to do that, and for me that was the reason that nobody really knew what the appropriate revaccination intervals were for those products. Anyway, sorry, it's an anecdote.
Some diagnostics being developed for the dog vaccines now, because we're also to do it every year. It suggests about every 3 years.
Yeah.
But that required, rather than doing field experimental studies, it was field studies on the diagnostics that was recently published. Did you want to ask something?
Yes. Yeah, you had a slide. You had a slide. I was very interested in DNA vaccination. So there is. I've heard that the vaccination was authorized by EME for salmon, I think, this year. However, what was the real challenge regarding safety of that? Because to my knowledge, we cannot really prove that there is no DNA integration of those DNA vaccines. How was that handled in order to finally accept it, and what are the perspectives for mammalians?
Yeah, okay. Do you want me to go into... I probably can't go into detail about it, but yes, you've identified the issues, and the issue is not whether it's a GMO, because it's clearly not, but what actually happens to the target animal, and does the target animal become a GMO? And clearly the salmon vaccine, I always forget what it's for. Is it IHN or IPN? Yeah, has been approved in Europe, and indeed it was in Canada and the US before that. Some years ago, there's a West Nile, I believe, as well in the US. There is another one that's been interesting to me that has bugged me actually, and Jackie may remember. And there's a product called Onset for canine melanoma, and it's actually, can I say this? Do you think it's actually imported into this country for treatment of dogs for melanoma under special license? It's a DNA product, but if you look at the EMA public, what do they call it, EPA, the public document on this, it has not been allowed in Europe because of that very reason, because they can't conclusively show whether there is integration or not. It's claimed that there isn't, but it can't be, or at least it hasn't been established. And so the EMA turned it down. But it means that we have some GM dogs running around. Or maybe they may be dead now of other causes, but I don't know. And maybe that's not an issue, but I think it needs to be recognised and it needs to be transparent.
Yeah, could I ask one more follow-up question?
Final question, yeah.
So, once a vaccine is licensed, if there's a preponderance of scientific data published that it's not effective, is it ever withdrawn? Or is it ever non-licensed?
I can't think of an example, but in theory, yes, it could be. And I talked about pharmacovigilance, and we have that system in Europe where people are supposed to complain about lack of efficacy or other issues. But the fact is they don't very often. But I think what happens actually with efficacy is the market finds out. And that farmers will know one way or another, at least to their own satisfaction, whether a vaccine works or not. And I've always said, actually, my own opinion has been why are we even bothered about efficacy? Why, people sell all sorts of things and claim all sorts of things for them, and we know they don't work. But as long as quality and safety are assured, the market will figure out whether these things work. Sorry, that's a personal opinion, and you'd probably disagree, but there we are.